So this is my chapter for segment 3 outline, and it begins on effects on neurotransmitter receptors. So some receptor antagonists bind directly to postsynaptic receptors and block them from being activated by their neurotransmitters. An example of this would be Curare, which blocks nicotinic ACH receptors, and they're generally found on muscles. The results of this would usually be paralysis of all skeletal muscles, and that includes those for breathing. There's also selective reuptake agonists, which bind to specific receptors and activate them, which mimic the natural neurotransmitters at those receptors. They're generally very potent with effects that vary depending on a particular type of receptor. An example of these would be LSD. There's also effects on cellular processes. So neurotransmitters can stimulate a variety of changes on a postsynaptic cell, such as activating second messengers, activating genes, or producing various proteins. So now entering the next section, which is some neuroactive drugs ease the symptoms of injury or psychiatric illness. So prior to the 1950s, half of all hospital beds were taken up by psychiatric patients. So we're going to break these down into different groups of psychiatric illnesses. So the first is antipsychotics relieve schizophrenia. So an antipsychotic or neuroleptic is a class of drugs that alleviate symptoms of schizophrenia. These would be Thorazine, Haldol, L'Occitane. They're all selective antagonists of dopamine D2 receptors. So there's typical antipsychotics, which is a class of antischizophrenic drugs whose principal mode of action is antagonism of dopamine D2 receptors. These alleviate positive symptoms like hallucinations and delusions. There's also atypical antipsychotics, which is a class of antischizophrenic drugs that have actions other than that, or in addition to dopamine D2 receptor antagonism, that are characteristic of typical antipsychotics. So these can be a blockade of certain serotonin receptors, and they reduce negative symptoms, which include impairment or loss of behavior, such as social withdrawal or blunted emotional responses. So we're now moving into antidepressants and their reducing factors on chronic mood problems. So affective disorders are one of the most common of all psychiatric complaints, and they're generally treated with antidepressants. Antidepressant is simply a class of drugs that relieve symptoms of depression. These were first developed in the 1950s, with the first being monoamine oxidase inhibitors, or MAO. There are things like Parnate or Marplan. They block the reuptake of monoamine neurotransmitters and allow them to accumulate in synapse to improve mood. The next class would be the tricyclic antidepressants, which act by increasing the synaptic accumulation of serotonin and norepinephrine. These are the second generation of antidepressants, and they're three-ringed molecular structures that block the reuptake of neurotransmitters in the presynaptic axon terminals, allowing, again, the accumulation in the synapse. This would be something like a tofranil. The next are going to be the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors and the selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, also known as SSRIs or SNRIs. These are things like fluoxetine, which is Prozac, sertraline, which is Zoloft, or escitalopram, which is Celexa. So now we're moving into anti-anxiety drugs or anxiolytics. So an anxiolytic is a class of substances that are used to combat anxiety. They're also known as tranquilizer and generally fall under the category of depressants. A depressant is just a drug that acts to reduce neural activity. Some of the original anxiolytics are alcohol and opiates. Barbiturates are also a type of sedative anxiolytic, which is derived from barbituric acid, and these have a very high risk of addiction and overdose potential. These reduce anxiety and promote sleep, and they can help prevent epileptic seizures. There's also the benzodiazepine agonists, which is a class of anti-anxiety drugs that binds to the GABA-A receptors. These would be Valium, Ativan. They are inhibitors of the GABA-A receptors, and the drug helps GABA produce larger inhibitory postsynaptic potentials that would be caused by GABA alone. So this reduces the excitability of a neuron. GABA-A receptors have many different binding sites. Some may facilitate or some may actually inhibit the effects of GABA. So many different drugs interact with these receptor complexes. Here we're also going to be talking about orphan receptors, which are any receptors for which no endogenous ligand has yet been discovered. These would also be the benzodiazepine sites, which is a type of orphan receptor. So allopregnanolone is a naturally occurring steroid that modulates GABA receptor activity in much of the same way that a benzodiazepine anxiolytic would. It's elevating during stress and has a calming effect. It also can calm the influence of alcohol. Neurosteroids are steroids that are produced in the brain and also act as a type of anxiolytic. They act on the GABA A receptors as well and produce anxiolytic, analgesic, and anticonvulsive effects. Other categories of anxiolytics are under investigation for neurotransmitter systems as well. We're now moving to the category of opiates. Opiates are potent in relieving pain relief. So the first opiate that was really found was opium, which is a heterogeneous extract of the seed pod juice of the opium poppy plant. And this has been used since the Stone Age. Following this was the development of morphine, which is an opiate compound derived from the poppy flower. And it's an effective analgesic, and it's also very much used in the healthcare system right now. So an analgesic really just refers to having pain-killing properties. A lot of these are very, very addictive, and many of them are also happen to be close relatives of heroin. Heroin, or diacetylmorphine, is an artificially modified and a very potent form of morphine, which is very closely related to oxycodone and fentanyl. So opioids act on opioid receptors, which is a receptor that responds to endogenous or exogenous opiates. They are concentrated in certain regions of the brain and limbic system, as well as the hypothalamic region, the locus ceruleus, and the periaqueductal duct. The periaqueductal gray is a neuronal body-rich region of the midbrain surrounding the cerebral aqueduct that connects the fourth and third ventricles, involved in pain perception. And this is where morphine acts to reduce pain. There's orphan opiate receptors, so there's things that we have no found endogenous ligands for. An endogenous ligand is a family of peptide transmitters that have been called the body's own narcotics. There are three kinds of endogenous ligands, and they go into enkephalins, endorphins, and dynorphins. When we're talking about receptors, there's three types of opioid receptors, delta, kappa, and mu. So opiate antagonism can also reverse the effects of opiates and block the rewarding aspects of opiates. So these can be treated for alcoholism or types of drug disorders, and an example of this would be naltrexone, which is used to treat alcoholism. So now moving into the next category, which is some neuroactive drugs are used to alter conscious experiences. So we start by talking about cannabinoids and their wide array of effects. So the biggest cannabinoid that everyone knows about is marijuana, which is a dried preparation of the cannabis sativa plant, and it's usually smoked to obtain THC. So THC is also tetrahydrocannabinol. The major active ingredients in a majority of cannabinoids, and they can cause respiratory problems, addiction, psychiatric disorders, and cognitive decline with heavy use. Some studies even have identified specific gene variants that are associated with a greater risk for psychiatric disorders through cannabinoid or THC's use. Cannabinoid receptors concentrated in the substantia nigra, hippocampus, and the cerebral cortex, and cerebral cortex, and they also are found in the brainstem. There are two subtypes of cannabinoid receptors, the CB1, which has to do with genetic disruptions of the CB1 receptors, can make mice unresponsive to rewarding properties of cannabinoid drugs. And these are the only receptors that are found, or the only cannabinoid receptors that are found in the nervous system. There's also CB2 receptors, which are found in the immune system. And either way, both of these receptors are G protein-coupled metabotropic receptors. So our endocannabinoid system has to do with the endogenous ligands of cannabinoid receptors. So they're actually analogs of marijuana that are produced in the brain. These act as retrograde messengers, which convey messages from postsynaptic to presynaptic cells, and they can modulate the release of neurotransmitters by the presynaptic nerve terminal. So one of the most common endocannabinoids is anandamide, which is an endogenous substance that binds to cannabinoid receptors. It can alter the function of memory formation. It can stimulate appetite, reduce the sensitivity to pain, and protect excitotoxic brain damage. Some other endogenous endocannabinoids include 2 2-arachidonyl glycerol and oleamide. But most of the CB1 receptors are found on GABAergic axon terminals, and these cannabinoids act on these receptors to modulate GABA release. With all this said, there are some beneficial effects of marijuana and endocannabinoids, and that includes improved mood, pain relief, decrease in blood pressure, combating nausea, and things like decreasing eye pressure from glaucoma, as well as a host of other things. The next section moves into stimulants and how they increase the activity of the neurosystem. So stimulants basically act to tip the balance of the excitatory and inhibitory responses toward excitatory, which helps create an alerting and activating effect. These include things like amphetamines, nicotine, caffeine, and cocaine. Some stimulants directly increase excitatory synaptic potentials, while others block normal inhibitory processes. Some of the more ancient stimulants is khat, which is an African shrub that is chewed and then will act as a stimulant. So there's also nicotine, which is very ancient as well, which is a compound found in plants, including tobacco, that acts as an agonist on a large class of cholinergic receptors. So nicotine exposure in adolescence has lasting impact on attention and cognitive development. And this is likely a consequence of impairment of the glutamatergic synapses in the prefrontal cortexes. There's nicotinic ACH receptors that drive the contractions of skeletal muscles and the activation of various visceral organs, and they are found in very high concentrations in the brain, and including the cortex, and some of these are said to enhance some cognitive performance. Cool fact is that nicotine from one cigarette can occupy 88% of all nicotinic receptors, and the nicotine generally acts directly on the ventral tegmental area, and it exerts its rewarding and addicting effects right there. Another stimulant is cocaine, which is considered a drug of abuse, and it's derived from the coca plant, and it potentiates catecholamine stimulation. It's an alkaloid stimulant that was first isolated in 1859. There's now different forms of cocaine, including crack, which is a smokable form that appeared in the 80s. This acts more rapidly and is much more addictive than the cocaine powder. Heavy cocaine use increases the risk for side effects such as stroke, psychosis, loss of gray matter, and severe mood disturbances. Cocaine acts by blocking monoamine transporters, especially those for dopamine, and slows the reuptake of neurotransmitters, which will boost the effects. Cocaine works through sensitization, so chronic cocaine use can provoke symptoms similar to psychosis. If you stop taking cocaine after addiction, withdrawal symptoms can include drug cravings, depression, and the inability to enjoy other things. This is generally thought to be because of the cerebral glucose metabolism is low for quite a few months after cocaine use. Cocaine is also a drug that displays dual dependence, which is dependence for emergent drugs that affect effects that only occur when two drugs are taken simultaneously. So an example of this is that when cocaine is metabolized in the presence of alcohol, it yields cocaethylene, which can develop an additional addiction. Another stimulant is an amphetamine, which is a molecule that resembles the structure of a catecholamine neurotransmitter and enhances their activity. A lot of these are synthetic psychostimulants. Amphetamines and methamphetamines cause the release of neurotransmitters from the presynaptic terminals, even in the absence of action potentials. So when action potentials do reach the terminals, these amphetamines potentiate that subsequent release of neurotransmitters. So amphetamines enhance activity two ways. The first is by blocking the reuptake of catecholamines in the presynaptic terminals, and the second is that it provides a target for the enzyme monoamine oxidase that normally would inactivate them. So amphetamines in the short term can increase vigor and stamina. It'll induce wakefulness, decrease appetite, and create feelings of euphoria. But on the long term, there's sleeplessness, severe weight loss, and general deterioration of the mental and physical condition. Prolonged use can even lead to paranoid schizophrenia type symptoms and brain damage. Amphetamines also act on the autonomic nervous system to produce things like an increase in blood pressure, tremors, dizziness, sweating, rapid breathing, and nausea. The next thing that we talk about is alcohol, which is actually both a stimulant and a depressant. So Moderate consumption is associated with reduced risk of cardiovascular and Alzheimer's disease, as well as improvement of blood sugar levels. Moderate consumption is usually equal to 1 drink a day for women and 2 drinks a day for men. So psychoactive effects of alcohol in the nervous system are biphasic. There's the initial stimulant phase, followed by a depressant phase. So alcohol activates the GABA A receptor coupled chlorine channels, which increases postsynaptic inhibition. So this contributes to the social disinhibition as well as the impairment of motor control coordination that occurs after a few drinks. There are low doses of alcohol that stimulate dopamine pathways and increase dopamine. So chronic abuse of alcohol damages neurons such as the Purkinje cells of the cerebellum and the hippocampal pyramidal cells. This damage can cause disorders like Korsakoff syndrome, which is due to the thiamine deficiency caused by alcohol syndrome. There's also things like fetal alcohol syndrome, which is a prenatal disorder. It's a disorder that includes intellectual disabilities and characteristic facial anomalies that affect children exposed to too much alcohol through maternal ingestion during the fetal development. So, there are two major lobes, especially the superior frontal association cortex, that are most affected by chronic alcohol use, although some of this damage is said to be able to be reversed through abstinence. Alcoholism is strongly related to hereditary conditions, and it may involve the upregulation of specific forms of NMDA receptors in the nucleus accumbens, which is the brain's reward circuitry. Binge drinking can also cause severe brain damage in the short term, especially to olfactory bulbs and limbic structures connected to the hippocampus. Severe binge drinking can impair cognitive ability, reduce neurogenesis, and can cause depressed breathing and death. So that's the end of the Chapter 4, Segment 3 outline.